I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. This morning, I welcome back to the virtual studio Conal Hanna, Media Partnerships Lead at Streem, our great sponsors here at Fear and Greed. As I mentioned last time, Conal is an astute watcher of what's going on in the media and how it's influencing society. Conal, welcome back.
Great to be with you, Sean.
I thought we'd start overseas today. China, is it my imagination, or do we just hear so much more about China nowadays than we ever did before?
Yeah, certainly. So we've been tracking China coverage for a number of years now, and we found, as you say, a pretty dramatic increase. For example, a couple of years ago, we worked with the ABC and found that coverage had doubled within 12 months from 2018 to 2019. And it's still trending up quite dramatically. Last year was a record high for China coverage, and that was largely off the back of two things: coronavirus, which you'd expect, and then the ongoing trade tensions, which actually created more coverage overall than coronavirus in terms of China coverage.
Wow, that's surprising. So what is the coverage mostly about? Trade?
To give you some sense, we sort of broke down China coverage into a few different topics. We had a look at how frequently China was associated with coronavirus, with trade, with national security concerns, human rights, a variety of threads that appear in China reporting. And what we found is that really trade dominates that conversation. So, obviously last year there was a lot of ongoing, a bit of a trade stoush developing between the countries and Australian exports on the outer over there. So that dominated the coverage, but that is true historically as well. We very much, certainly the media very much sees this relationship as dominated through that economic lens.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you think of Australia's other great trade partner, which is Japan, you think of Indonesia, which is on our doorstep and has hundreds of millions of people, literally India, which is 1 billion people. We don't seem to cover those countries anywhere near as much.
No, that's right. And that's something that's really become apparent, is that China dominates so much in terms of our Asian coverage now in Australia. As an example, there was more reporting about China in Australian media last year than the next 5 Asian countries combined. So that includes Japan, India, Indonesia, Singapore and South Korea. Yeah, I don't know that it's entirely healthy that we lose sight on our broader region. But, essentially there has been the story of China emerging as a geopolitical power is a big one. And Australia's got a pretty crucial role living on their doorstep.
Has the coverage changed much? I mean, 10 years ago, China was mostly about human rights. Now, you mentioned the economy and trade and national security. Has the coverage become more sophisticated, for want of a better word?
That's a good question. Whether it's more sophisticated, I don't know, but it's certainly a lot more economy dominated. So over the past 12 months, national security concerns only generated about a quarter as much coverage as the trade issue. And human rights was only about 7% of the coverage that trade generated around China. So whilst we do pay attention to those issues, we probably don't pay as much attention to them as much as we did. And it's no surprise given that about a third of Australian exports go to China, so that the economy really does dominate.
There were a number of trade issues last year: barley, beef, cotton, wine, coal, a lot of stranded ships off the ports of China. Was there one that was bigger than the others?
Yeah, so obviously lots of media coverage about Australian exports to China being blocked. The commodity that probably broke through the most was wine. That generated the most coverage when that happened in November, December.
Penfolds Grange.
That's right. Probably a lot more Australians relate to a bottle of wine than maybe barley, for example, which is a bit remote to most people. But barley was actually the number 2 because that was one of the first things that happened back in May when they slapped an 80% tariff on Australian barley. So the top 4 were wine, barley, coal and beef. They were the 4 that were probably well ahead of some of the others, but there was no shortage of commodities that were in the news last year.
And what about Hong Kong? Because that was a big story, geopolitical story last year and continues. Did that get much coverage?
Look, Hong Kong coverage has kind of been on the decline since 2019. It's still in the news, obviously, quite a lot in terms of some of the tensions there and the human rights issues, but it has been falling. Coverage of Xinjiang province has increased steadily, but it's not nearly at the level of Hong Kong. So you've kind of got Hong Kong and then you've got Xinjiang and Taiwan.
Okay. Moving on, earnings season. I had a great time the last 3 weeks. I'm not sure whether the listeners enjoyed it quite as much as I did, but there were plenty of profit reports out for the half year to the end of December. I'm just interested in the sort of coverage it got. Was it broad-based, or was it just, we at Fear and Greed who love earnings season that seem to dominate us, but what about everywhere else?
Yeah, look, I think the circumstances coming after the pandemic-induced recession meant there was broader interest in the business community and the results and how companies are tracking. And you'd have to say that overall coverage has been pretty positive and reflecting the earnings season that many companies had. So one of the things we did was look at which companies created the most headlines on their results day. We measured that by how much time they spent at the top of leading websites on the day their results were released. Of that top 10 that we looked at, there was only really a couple that you would consider kind of bad news results, and that, is largely testament to the circumstances they find themselves in. The rest of them were quite positive. So 3 of the top 5 were iron ore miners, BHP, Rio and Fortescue, all announcing record dividends. And so that generated a lot of headlines and a lot of relatively positive headlines.
And the other 2, the top 5?
So, the top 2 were between BHP and CBA. So CBA was a narrow second, and they were also, a relatively good news story in that their dividend was up, and there was an expectation there might be more to come in August.
Okay, BHP and CBA are the 2 biggest companies in the country. The one with the most shareholders, though, is Telstra. It's got 1.3 million shareholders. Did that get much of a run?
Yeah, Telstra was in the top 10 as well, and certainly find a lot of focus on their dividend. And a lot of people have Telstra shares. And they're interested in what they're doing. So Andy Penn's announcement that they'd be maintaining that dividend and continuing to do so, that led to a 6-month share price high and also led to quite sustained coverage.
Conal, stay with me. We'll be back in a second. My guest this morning is Conal Hanna, Media Partnerships Lead at Streem. Now, a couple of the stories that came out, they may not even be top 50 stocks anymore. One was Qantas and the other's AMP. However, they're kind of iconic, Qantas and AMP. They're part of the folklore of Australia. How'd they go?
Yeah, Qantas was the 3rd highest interest in terms of their results. I think there's no surprises that they're struggling a little bit financially at the moment, given that there's very few places they can fly to.
They lost $1 billion. Not bad.
Yeah, that's right. $1 billion loss, $1.1 billion loss for the half. And a lot of interest, I think, in what Alan Joyce says around international travel. Obviously, they've been champing at the bit to resume international travel and had plans to do so from July. They've pushed that back to October now. But I think a lot of people kind of hanging on their word as to when they can resume travelling again.
And AMP's result wasn't particularly good either, and it was at the time where Aries withdrew its offer for the whole business, though subsequently it has decided it's interested in its property and infrastructure assets. Did that get much of a run?
Yeah, AMP also featured in the top 10. It was about number 7, and it was very much focused. There was kind of the confluence of issues there where you had the results come out that showed that assets under management were down again. They didn't pay a dividend, but then you also had the RS offer kind of falling away at the exactly same time. So that certainly led to increased interest.
And Parliament's been sitting the last few weeks too, so there's been a lot more coverage of politics. What's happening in that world?
Yeah, so in the last week, we did a bit of an exercise where we had a look at which politicians' profiles were up in 2021 compared to the second 6 months of last year.
I'm guessing Tanya Plibersek.
Yes, very good guess, Sean. She's definitely increased her profile a little bit this year. You see, she had a big spike around that confrontation she had in Parliament House with Craig Kelly over vaccinations. And she has been doing quite a bit of other media as well. So it's led to a bit of leadership speculation. Some of that media has been outside her control, obviously. When Anthony Albanese rejigged the front bench, you saw a bit of speculation and conversations about who was getting what, etc. So her name came up a lot there. But she does do a lot of regular spots as well on places like Sky News and 4BC in Brisbane. So just interesting to watch her build her profile.
I presume the point you're making there, Sky News and 4BC, are certainly going to be more conservative than perhaps the ABC. So you think she's reaching out a bit potentially?
Yeah, look, I think it's important for political leaders if they want to be either, prime ministerial material or senior cabinet ministers to have a broad base. I think it's no secret that Labor needs to broaden its appeal beyond the capital cities. And I think, Tanya Plibersek is someone who's trying to do that.
So who else has been in the news in terms of politics?
So looking at whose media profile was up the most this year compared to last year, Tanya Plibersek was number 1, and then Linda Reynolds came in at number 2. Probably no surprise, the Defence Minister has generated an awful lot of headlines in the last couple of weeks and is currently on leave. Behind that, you also had sizable increases to Mark Butler, who, of course, was dumped as Climate Change Minister, and Chris Bowen, his replacement. And then the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, is also up 144% on his average levels for last year. That's partly because he did have a stint in the top job when Scott Morrison was on holidays.
So yesterday, Attorney General Christian Porter categorically denied rape allegations relating to an alleged incident that occurred 33 years ago. Tragically, the woman who made the allegations took her own life last year. That's, I suppose, obviously going to a while to run in terms of not just this week, but that will go on for a few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this story is going to be dominant in the media cycle for quite some time to come. You've already had a couple of weeks where rape has really dominated the headlines in Australia based on the Brittany Higgins case. That's been the number one story in Australia for the last 2 weeks, which is quite unusual, the length of time that it really dominated the news cycle for. And now this story with Christian Porter seems to take it to a whole nother level. So it's going to be fascinating because it's legally a very challenging one. Obviously, with the alleged victim deceased, it's going to be extremely difficult to navigate. And so I imagine we'll be reading about this a lot.
Let's just hope the media are sensitive about their reporting of it. You can't go, Conal, though, because I want you to not just tell us what has happened, but what's going to happen. It's crystal ball time. So you've mentioned there about the rape allegations, that they will certainly be dominant in the next few weeks. What else do you think will be around?
One thing that always emerges at this time of year is definitely the football codes really kick into gear. We've tracked over the past couple of years the interest in Australian sports, and it's interesting moving from tennis and A-League season, and then you see this just real ramp up when AFL and NRL kick off. So I think that'll be one thing that it certainly dominates a few headlines. Hopefully the players all behave themselves as well, because that's one thing that can also dominate headlines is when player misbehaviour emerges.
They always get plenty of media attention. Conal, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Not a problem. Thanks, Sean.
That was Conal Hanna, Media Partnerships Lead at Streem.